So my name is Resi Polixia. I was at the park in Lowell for about 12 years, and I just moved on to a different position with the National Park Service. So I work remotely now, but my history with the parks goes back even before I arrived in Lowell. So I'm originally from New Jersey, and there was a national park in my hometown, and I took an internship there after I finished high school. And from that was able to come back and work as a ranger for a few seasons. And then I moved to Lowell and stayed here for a very long time.
So my name is Heather Barrett. I use she, her pronouns. I teach at Boston University in the College of Arts and Sciences writing program, and I focus in particular in my classes on gender and sexuality in 19th century America. I think teaching LGBTQIA history is really important for a lot of reasons. I guess I think about it in terms of being somebody who teaches usually first year and first semester college students. I have a lot of students who themselves identify as queer in one way or another. And so I think for them in particular, it's so validating to have their identities and experiences and sense of who they are and the bigger cultural narratives that they're part of validated through an institution like a university and like education, because a lot of times they haven't had that up until that point coming to college. Sometimes they have, but a lot of times they haven't. So I think for students where this is like there's a personal resonance, it makes a huge difference to just have themselves kind of be seen and reflected in that way in the curriculum. But I also think for students where there isn't a personal connection, it's equally important because it's an opportunity for them to learn. And in I have a lot of students who may or may not have had exposure. They may or may not know a lot of queer people prior to coming to college. And so I think for them, it's really eye-opening. And it kind of supplements the personal connections that they're making with their peers. But I think having it in a classroom space where they feel comfortable asking questions and being, learning in a way where they're not being judged, like they might be in some other spaces, I think is really helpful too. So I try to think about both of those audiences when I think about teaching this kind of material, I would say.
LGBTQ history, when people think of it, they might not associate it with a place like Lowell. They might think of it only in big cities like New York or San Francisco. And the reality is, like, in any context in the world, it's the LGBTQ history is not isolated to just big areas. It happened everywhere, including in towns like Lowell. And I think the other thing I hope people take from the walk is that Lowell has such a broad history of like lots of different marginalized people kind of coming here to this city. And, sometimes LGBTQ people are kind of left out of that conversation. People think about like women or people of color or immigrants or refugees, right? Or like the working class who kind of makes up the city. But there is an angle of LGBTQ history kind of overlaid with all of that too. So that's the other thing I hope people take away from it, is that these all converge here on this spot. I was a history major in college, so I am kind of trained academically as a historian. I remember when I was a senior and I was writing like a big kind of like senior paper kind of thing, senior project. There's different ways to approach history, right? And like I think in school you learn about primary sources, you learn about secondary sources. So primary sources were the ones that were created at the time you're studying. So like newspapers, photographs, like that kind of thing. We talked about the Lowell Offering literary magazine. That's a primary source example. And then secondary sources are ones that are written by other scholars who are studying the same thing you are. And they can kind of leave a trail of like breadcrumbs for you to follow when you're starting your own research. When I was in college, I had different professors telling me, you start with the primary sources. No, you start with the secondary sources, right? So I kind of went through a mix of both, I guess, when I was trying to get to LGBTQ history here in Lowell. So
yeah, it's so hard, and it's I think it's hard even for those of us that like study this as our jobs. I think it's hard to be caught up because the language changes historically, and again, like it's in different ethnic groups, different just different like socioeconomic classes, things like that. Like the language might look really different even at the same moment in time across other categories like that. So
A lot of it was primary source material I started with. So there is another Mill Girl book that we talked a little bit on the tour called Loom and Spindle, which was written by Harriet Hanson Robinson. And in it, she has like little mini biographies of different mill girls. And so I was like, I'll just start there and see if there's anything that piques my interest. And there was. So that was kind of a lead that I was able to find. And there are other researchers in Lowell who have done LGBTQ history, like before I started doing it. So I was able to kind of pick up from where their research left off. And they had done oral histories, and like I was able to read those and learn a lot from those and kind of dig a little deeper into primary sources from that. So that's sort of how I got started. It depending on the era, it's different forms, different sources. So
I was a seasonal park ranger here in Lowell when I was a graduate student. So that was kind of my summer job. And I guess I was in my early 20s at that time. So I identified very strongly with the mill girls. I was like, 200 years ago, this might be what I was doing. So I think it was, so I actually think a good place to start is like when we say mill girls, they were really like young adult women, probably like age 15 through 25 or so. But the patriarchal language of the time, treated any unmarried woman as a girl, regardless of the actual age. But they were mostly at least early in the era that we're thinking about, like 1820s through 1840s. Mostly white, mostly from kind of Anglo-Saxon backgrounds, from farming communities kind of around New England. And they were recruited specifically because they were young, because they were women, because they were unmarried. They were kind of seen as an untapped labor force at that time, which is kind of funny because it's not like people didn't work all the time. If you lived on a farm, you worked from when the sun came up until when the sun went down, and then even longer if you had candles and things like that. So they were very accustomed to very hard work of all different types, but they weren't accustomed to being paid. So I think that the reason why many young women found this work appealing, despite the fact that it was long hours, very unsafe working conditions, very grueling, tedious work. But that was true of farm work, and the flip side of that was they weren't getting paid. Whereas here you'd make $2 a week, and you'd have to pay some of that toward living in the boarding house, but you'd have a little bit of money left over, which is better than no money. And so I think it afforded them a kind of freedom that was appealing and also really unusual at the time for young unmarried women to have. So it was just a really unique role and an opportunity that wasn't something that they could find in a lot of other places, I think. Yeah, actually, I think so. You're probably thinking about Lucy Larkham. It was actually the reverse. So she was born in Beverly, Massachusetts, and then came to Lowell because her mother moved the family to Lowell after her father died. Her mother needed, again, there were not a lot of easy ways for women of any age to sort of support themselves and their families if they didn't have a male breadwinner. So. But one thing that a married or widowed woman could do was to be a boarding house keeper and kind of oversee the young unmarried women working in the mills. So Lucy's mother did that, and then Lucy, because she was living here as a sort of preteen girl, I think she was 11 when she started working in the mills, and she did that for about 10 years. And then later in life, she became a teacher, and then eventually became a writer in her own regard and kind of supported herself that way. Which actually was something that a lot of women did increasingly, like later in the 19th century. But writing then today, and certainly historically, is you could make money, but it wasn't always a guaranteed source of income in the way that like a job that you showed up every day was. So. But yeah, she had a pretty interesting life, and we think of her now, at least some of us think of her now as queer. So because of the different relationships that she had that were so strong with other women, and the fact that she pretty aggressively rejected the idea of marrying a guy, which was kind of unusual for the time. There was this real sense that either way, you were a working woman if you were a teacher or if you were a factory girl or a mill girl, but I think teaching was one of the very few things that was seen as respectable work for young women, maybe because you were working with children, maybe because it was kind of there was sort of this ideal in the 19th century that women were very much responsible for raising the next generation of democratic citizens and making sure that they had the right morals and the right principles so that they would do make sure that America was on the right track and everything. So a lot of women did that as in their role as mothers in the home. But I think being a teacher was maybe almost seen as kind of an extension of that for young unmarried women, maybe before they became mothers. So I think that's maybe why that potential path was seen as more respectable, whereas being a factory girl, it's, there wasn't necessarily like a moral contribution that you were making. You were making products instead. And so there was, I think, some anxiety about if that kind of removed you from the moral order and the reproductive order and all of that. And actually, a lot of women who worked here in the mills did then go on to go home and get married. So it's not like it was a very temporary thing in a lot of ways. But people felt kind of weird about it for one reason or another.
So my biggest kind of tip off for the bar scene was going through oral histories that had already been compiled. So I owe kind of a lot of debt and gratitude to the people who did that. Those were Mehmet Ali and Beth Brassel, who work at the library. And so they put those oral histories at the Center for Lowell History, which is part of UMass Lowell. And when I was working at the park, that was kind of like our big research library we would go to a lot. So I'm very lucky that those already existed and some of that legwork started. And there's one particular oral history where he does list off a few bars, and that gave me leads to look into. And so from there, I went kind of diving into newspaper archives and just entering the names of those bars and seeing what came up. So in the case of the Cosmopolitan, I think that was the one with the most that came up in the newspaper archives. And, in the earlier eras, in the earlier days of it being established, like 1920s, 1930s, a lot of what was there was like the advertisements for it, kind of the adjoining lunch bar for men. And, one of those advertisements had a photo of the owner. So from there, I got the owner's name and started looking into the owner in the newspaper. And that's how I got to the kind of over the top masculine, gossip column that was about him. So that was very interesting to find. And so kind of looking at the language of that I found in the advertisements and in that kind of gossip column tipped me off a little bit. And then because it was so long lasting, in the later years, a lot of its appearances in the Lowell Sun were more like police reports and crime reports. And that corroborates with what was told in the oral history too, which talks about the Cosmopolitan being a bit more like a rowdy kind of atmosphere. So that's kind of the most that I was able to do was around the Cosmopolitan. And in my time at the park, I started looking into some of the other bars that were mentioned. So the Majestic was one of them, which in the oral history was recounted as being kind of more middle class and not super formal, but definitely more formal than the Cosmopolitan would be. And again, there were some kind of police reports that popped up with the Majestic too around the gambling that happened in the bar area on the first floor in the basement and in the apartments above it as well. And because of that, the police reports do also list kind of the owner of the building and who was kind of the person responsible. So you can kind of dig into different layers after that too. And you just kind of go down a wild rabbit hole a little bit. It's very easy to do that. But it's interesting, you come up with interesting things.
Yeah, there's so much, and I think I always try to remember that again we're kind of working with students where this is their first exposure to kind of keep it as nuts and bolts 101 level as possible, because you can always build on that, but you have to it's good to have a solid foundation. So two really important concepts that I try to teach. One is that gender is something, and sexuality, and actually a lot of identity markers are very socially and historically contingent, and there are things that look really different, not just for individual people. There's many different ways that people can express being a woman or being a man or anything in between, but there's also that looks so different in different cultures at different time periods across other identity markers in different classes for different ethnic groups. So I think helping students understand that there's not one way to express a particular type of gender or sexual identity is a really basic thing, but it's so crucial to kind of scaffold more complex understandings of these things.
And this is where turning to secondary sources really help. So my tip off for understanding the language of like romantic friendships and like stuff in the 19th century comes from other people doing queer history. So I had not come across. I remember once like a professor of mine in school talked about the concept of Boston marriages. And so like I got that from that context. But in terms of like the romantic friendship side that like some of the mill girls might have had, there's a historian named Lillian Faderman. And so in one of her works, she talks about kind of that relationship model of romantic friendship or intimate friendship. And she talks about how in the 19th century, that was a bit more of an accepted kind of a model for relationship having, and not just accepted, but also encouraged, right? Especially for young women, it was supposed to be like their practice marriage. So that's where it really helps to like have other people to rely on and see what's already been done. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel yourself.
A really important early work in queer theory is a book called Epistemology of the Closet by Eve Sedgwick that was published in 1990. And in that book, she is a literary scholar, although she also is one of the founding sort of queer theory people as well. And I don't necessarily teach that book, but I kind of, it's a concept that informs a lot of what we talk about. There's even having categories like heterosexual and homosexual, like it's not that those categories aren't useful or aren't important or aren't validating for people, but they're essentially made up. And she kind of just raises the question like, why did we make up these categories and why do we have to view it as a binary? It's not that it's bad, but it's just also not the only way to understand these things. And so I think whenever you think about queer history, it's really helpful to think about just that possibility and that expansiveness and the fact that we have certain ways of constructing things and labeling things and making sense of things, and that's all good. But it also doesn't always have to be that way. And so I think just always knowing that there's other ways to describe things or other ways to imagine or invent new terms or new concepts, that's a really kind of like fundamental thing that I think I just try to be mindful of in how we talk about these things.
So Lillian Faderman talks about how at the turn of the century, especially where like psychology as a field is becoming much more popular, how kind of the mainstream psychologists we all hear about, like Jung and Freud and all of those guys, were very interested in sort of like studying people and like inventing these categories to like categorize people, right? And be like, now a study of the homosexual man and now a study of this weird lady who doesn't like men, right? So that was kind of, I think, where Lillian Faderman argues that a big shift in that language came from. It's not just all in psychology's field, but there's also like, if you look at the literary history of that era too, there's definitely some works of literature that are responsible for coining new phrases. A really popular term for a while around the turn of the century was the invert for queer women. So that was like, you know, if you're not into guys, then like, you know, that means you're an invert because you have inverted like desires or something, like you're kind of doing the opposite of what you're supposed to be doing. And for some queer women, especially those who would have been more like kind of masculine of center, maybe gender identity, like that was really a term that was latched onto. And I believe Radcliffe Hall, who wrote The Well of Loneliness, don't remember the exact date that was published, 1910 or 1920, if I had to guess. That's how they identified themselves as well, or that's how their main character identified themselves. So there's a lot of world making and community making around language through literature too, in addition to like people trying to categorize people psychologically. So that's where I think we see a big shift, is around the turn of the century with those things.
As somebody who like literature is like my entry point into understanding a lot of things about the past and even about the world today. I study fiction mostly too, like short stories and novels and things like that. And something that I think about a lot is like, just because something is a work of fiction doesn't mean it's not true in some way. Like, and the truth doesn't just have to be biographical or objective. Like, you can write about a character who's not technically a real person, but still reflects the experiences and the feelings and the just like the range of human emotions and ways of existing in the world. And in some ways, I think you can do that in literature more freely than you might be able to in like a more objective way of writing. And I think that was, I think that may be true today as well, but I think especially historically, a lot of writers found fictional ways to talk about things that felt very real to them. And I think I just always think about that today when I guess as a sort of as a person who's like squarely in the millennial generation, like I had one experience of coming into queerness at a moment where there were certain labels and certain ways of talking about it that made a lot of sense to me at the time and still kind of shape how I think about it. But now working with like younger people in Gen Z, they have just, they actually, I mean, their way of understanding these things isn't totally different than ours, but they have labels for things that just like didn't exist even 10 or 15 years ago. And I think some people can be dismissive of that or say like, you know, like they're making up too many terms or this is silly or why do you need another flag or whatever. But I'm like, why not? You know, like why not have, I think that creativity and that willingness to just look for more and more ways to understand our experiences and to find community and to also make sense of who we are as individuals, like more of that can't be bad, I don't think. And so I think having that sort of like knowing that you can do that creatively in fiction means like, why can't you do that in real life too? So
gender and sexuality like are definitely socially constructed categories, right? Because people invent new words, people invent new ways of thinking about themselves. And that is even truer when you step outside of like white American kind of culture. Growing up, so in Tagalog, which is the language my mom spoke, there is no gender for a third person pronoun. There's only one third person pronoun for everybody, which is siya. And because of that, if you tried to talk to my mom or any of my aunties or my uncles in English, like they would always mix up he and she all the time for everybody. It wasn't just a like, you look kind of weird, so I'm not sure what pronoun to put on you. It was more like, oh, no, yes, that person, he, she, whatever. Like it's, you know, it was all over the place. And so when I learned that and when I figured that out, I was like, oh, that's really cool. And it's kind of subversive in a way that's not even trying to be subversive, right? The Philippines, like brief colonial history of the Philippines was a Spanish colony from like the 1500s to 1898, I think, in the Spanish-American War. And then Spain like gifted the Philippines to the United States, and it was a US colony until like right before World War II, but America still held military bases there until like the 90s, and now there's more military bases coming back. So it's like a neo-colony kind of vibes. So there's a lot of colonization that happened. And my point is that like, especially with Spain, like this is why the Philippines is like such a Catholic country in Asia, and it seems so random, but like with the Spanish being there, like colonization is also forcing religion on people in a lot of ways, and that is Catholicism in the case of the Philippines. And so, you know, but still to this day, like when you speak Tagalog, it's still that one gender neutral pronoun kind of thing, which is pretty cool. And so for me, that kind of like builds into how I see myself gender identity wise, right? So like in English, my pronoun is they, them, but honestly, I feel like the pronoun I really like a lot is not even English, it's Tagalog, and I think it's just cool. It's reassuring in a way because it's like you're not just doing this weird like American thing, but like there is a cultural basis for it that like, you know, it is accepted and revered.
There is a lot, and there's so much more than there was. Like there's so much that has, well, there's so much more queer stuff today. I read so much queer like YA stuff now, because even though I'm not technically, I think the target audience for YA is somebody who's almost 37 years old, but I wanted it so badly when I was 18 and it didn't exist. So I get very excited about that stuff is out there now. So I think there's so much to dive into with like contemporary stuff, but then the historical stuff, there's just more and more things that have been discovered. Like even just in my time as somebody that's been studying this for 15 or 20 years, like there's so much more that just gets published, and that people either see new works in different ways. We learn biographically about authors that maybe we could see as queer now through a contemporary lens that maybe that wasn't seen before. So, but I think you just start somewhere. I think if there's an author you really like, if there's a type of work you really like, there's no kind of wrong way to do it. And I think just picking one thing and then kind of seeing what else is out there and learning from other people. There's so many people. I think people who study queer stuff are usually very excited to share that knowledge with other people, because we have this sense of wanting to expand the just the awareness of what's out there. A lot of times people are surprised that there is as much as there is in the 19th century in particular. I think people just assume like gay people didn't exist before the 1950s or something like that, and it's not true. So I think, whenever I can kind of be like an ambassador to like helping people, open that up and see that, that's a good thing.
So I was a history major. I am like very like academic brain, like I think historically, but I also kind of view history as telling a story in and of itself, right? I feel like very lucky that I'm able to kind of see the continuity between like queer existence today and in the past. And I think for me, that kind of gives me a lot of inspiration in a way. Like when I was first starting to like question and like understand my gender identity more, like I was already with Heather at that point. And like I had this like phrase that I kept coming back to. I was like, I just feel historically butch, and I don't know how to explain that in other words than that. But it's sort of like just kind of thinking as I was reading through all of these accounts of people in the past who shared this identity with me, right? Like it kind of gave me a lot of inspiration and just better clarity. And I don't know, there's also a sense of gratitude, I feel like too, for like learning about, like our queer ancestors, right? So it's kind of thinking of them that way. So I feel kind of fortunate to be able to like think of them as queer ancestors and recognize that. And kind of, I don't know, I sort of believe in like communicating with the ancestors. So like, I feel like I've opened a line of communication to them, hopefully, which is cool.
Yeah, I mean, I really focus on 19th century American literature, and even within the 19th century, I'd say like the first 60 years, people tend to divide American lit up kind of like pre-Civil War and post-Civil War. So I think more about the pre-Civil War era, which is a really interesting time for gender and sexuality because there's really rigid gender norms at that time. Like on the one hand, there's like very set ways, at least for like white middle class Americans, to be gendered as male or female, but it's a kind of a more fluid time in some ways for sexuality because it's not a time, it's before the era where we start getting terms like heterosexual and homosexual. That comes later in the 19th century. So there aren't a lot of specific labels that categorize people, and because of that, things are it's harder to track things down, but it's also more fluid and messier, and I think more interesting in some ways because it is a little more chaotic. I think it's a never-ending process, and I think being a scholar in general, but I think especially being somebody that studies queer stuff is very humbling because there's always more that you can uncover, and there's always more that you can understand. I think for me, the way that I manage it is being. I think I try to go for like depth rather than breadth, and to like really look at like one period really closely rather than trying to understand everything across every culture or every time period. Although I think there's value to having that breadth too, but I think it's really helpful to like then look to other people that have that expertise at other times, and just know that you can always learn more. There's always new stuff that's being uncovered too, even when we think we have a full picture. There's always more that we're going to find out.